November 19th, 1944. The Hartgen Forest, Western Germany. Before dawn fully broke, the cold arrived first. Not the mild chill of an autumn morning, but the deep, marrow-reaching freeze that only a forest at war truly knows. The Hartgen stretched across 60 square miles of ancient spruce and fir, a cathedral of trees so dense the sky above was barely a suggestion, a pale gray bruise glimpsed between canopy and cloud. The ground beneath was mud-hardened to iron, shattered tree roots jutting upward like broken fingers. The smell was pine resin, cordite, and something older, the mineral cold of soil that has swallowed too many men. Shards of artillery burst wood lay, scattered across every clearing like the wreckage of some great ship. The forest did not feel like a battlefield. It felt like a tomb. Somewhere inside that darkness, a young American soldier lay perfectly still. He had been there since before midnight. He would not move for another 4 hours. He was not yet 23 years old. He came from a state where the winters bit hard, and the land rewarded patience over noise. He had learned to read terrain the way a farmer reads weather, not with instruments, but with instinct refined through years of cold mornings and quiet observation. He held his M1903A4 Springfield rifle against the frozen floor, its Weaver M73B1 telescopic scope sweeping in near imperceptible arcs across the tree line 140 meters distant. His breathing was controlled, measured, almost liturgical in its discipline. And beside him, tucked against a root and wrapped in a folded piece of canvas to retain its warmth, sat a single tin cup of coffee. The coffee was not an accident. Nothing he did was an accident. That cup was a weapon, perhaps the most consequential weapon he would carry across those 6 days in November 1944. To understand what happened in that forest, and why it mattered far beyond any single engagement, we must first understand what the Hartgen Forest represented in the autumn of 1944. The Allied advance that had thundered with such momentum following the liberation of Paris in August had, by September, begun to slow. The Germans had retreated in disarray, yes, but they had retreated with purpose, drawing American forces into terrain that nullified every advantage the United States possessed. Air power was useless beneath a canopy this thick. Armor could not maneuver through trees this dense. Artillery, though devastating, was as likely to turn falling timber into secondary shrapnel that killed Americans as it was to dislodge German defenders. The Hartgen Forest was, in the blunt assessment of the American official military historian Charles B. McDonald, a misconceived and fruitless battle that should have been avoided. Yet it could not be avoided. The Siegfried Line ran along its eastern edge. The Rhine lay beyond. And so between September 19th, 1944 and February 10th, 1945, some of the fiercest and most psychologically devastating combat of the entire Western Front unfolded beneath those ancient trees. American casualties in the Hartgen exceeded 33,000 men, dead, wounded, captured, and broken by exhaustion and exposure. It was, yard for frozen yard, among the most costly fights the United States Army endured in all of Europe. And within that grinding, remorseless attrition, a new and terrible kind of warfare had taken root. Snipers, German and American alike, turned every fallen log, every ruined farmhouse wall, every shadow between the trees into a possible last breath. Movement meant exposure. Exposure meant death. The forest had become a lesson in the oldest military principle there is. The man who controls his patience controls the ground. The German army understood this principle with the authority of doctrine. Wehrmacht sniper training was among the most rigorous of any army in the Second World War. German Scharfschützen, sharpshooters, were trained not merely in marksmanship, but in the science of observation. Their field manuals emphasized, with characteristic Teutonic precision, the detection of enemy positions through indirect indicators. Smoke rising from a position, the glint of a lens catching winter light, the disturbed pattern of frost on a surface that should have been undisturbed, the smell of cigarette smoke, the sound of a boot pressing too firmly into icy ground, and critically steam, the thin white curl of warm breath or warm liquid rising against cold air. Any sign of human warmth in a cold landscape was, according to German doctrine, a potential fix on an enemy position. They had been trained to hunt by warmth. They had been trained to kill by it. This was the knowledge that the young American sniper decided to turn against them. His name, as referenced in after-action reports and intelligence assessments compiled by the 4th Infantry Division, was recorded in fragmentary form. The bureaucratic shorthand of wartime documentation often stripped individual soldiers of the full measure of their stories. But what those documents captured, precisely and without embellishment, was the outcome of his 6-day campaign, 97 confirmed German casualties, attributed to a single operator working alone, using a technique so simple and so devastating that it would later be studied by American sniper training cadres and adapted by other marksmen across the final months of the European War. The technique worked like this. Before settling into his primary firing position, always selected first, always checked for multiple exit routes, always positioned so that the target zone lay within his effective range, while he himself was concealed at an oblique angle, he would establish what he called his front room. This was a secondary location, positioned in the enemy's line of sight, close enough to be visible under magnification, far enough that it appeared to represent a genuine forward observation post or command point. Into this secondary position, he placed props. Sometimes it was a helmet set on a pole, sometimes a rifle leaned against a log. But always, without exception, he placed the tin cup. The cup was filled with coffee, real coffee, drawn from the generous supply of C-ration instant coffee that the United States Army issued to its soldiers as standard field equipment. American soldiers in 1944 received coffee as a fundamental component of their daily ration. The War Department had classified it as essential, not a luxury, not a morale supplement in the way that cigarettes were treated, but a necessity of combat effectiveness. By the final years of the war, the average American soldier consumed approximately 32.5 pounds of coffee per year in the field. In terms of material abundance, it was among the most visible expressions of what the industrial power of a free nation could deliver to its men in the field, even in a forest in the middle of Germany in the dead of winter. A hot cup of coffee was not remarkable to an American soldier. It was expected. To a German soldier in the Hurtgen in late 1944, it was something else entirely. The German military supply chain had been under catastrophic strain since the failures on the Eastern Front. Wehrmacht frontline rations had declined in both quantity and quality with brutal consistency as the war progressed. Where a German soldier had entered the war in 1939, receiving adequate, if unremarkable field provisions, by the winter of 1944, many frontline units were subsisting on less than half the calories of their American counterparts. American forces consistently received between 3,400 and 4,100 calories per day through supply chains that, even in the chaos of a contested forest, delivered with a regularity that bordered on the miraculous to German observers. The physical and psychological gap between the two armies' material conditions had widened into something almost ideological. When German soldiers encountered evidence of American abundance, a discarded K-ration tin containing items that exceeded anything their own mess could provide, a half-eaten chocolate bar left behind in a hastily abandoned position, the effect on morale was documented with quiet alarm in Wehrmacht officer reports. Some men laughed dismissively, attributing it to American excess and soft living. Others grew quiet. A nation that could waste food like this, that could ship chocolate to soldiers in a forest in Germany, what did it mean about the limits of that nation's capacity to produce, to resupply, to endure? It was a question that German officers discouraged their men from pursuing to its logical conclusion. The American sniper understood this dynamic, whether consciously or through the accumulated intuition of a man who had spent weeks observing his enemy. He understood that a German soldier trained to scan for warmth in a cold landscape would see that thin thread of steam rising from the tin cup and feel, at the same moment, both a tactical urgency and something harder to name. A flicker of fascination, even longing, for what that small vessel represented. Warmth, nourishment, The ease of a nation that sent its soldiers into the worst forest in Germany and still ensured they had hot coffee. The cup drew the eye. The doctrine demanded the eye follow the steam. And the doctrine made the eye hold there, scanning for the position behind the cup, looking for the shooter who must be near his own warmth, the man who moments ago set down his morning coffee to raise his rifle. They looked where their training told them to look. They looked at the front room, at the decoy, at the steam. They adjusted position slightly to get a better angle, to assess, to confirm. They moved. He was not where they were looking. He was never where they were looking. The M1903A4 Springfield, chambered in .3006 Springfield, delivered its projectile with a muzzle velocity of approximately 2,800 feet per second. At the distances he typically worked, between 80 and 160 meters in the close terrain of the Hurtgen, the round arrived before the sound fully registered to nearby observers. There was no thunder, no drama. There was the cup, sitting in its position, trailing its thread of steam. There was a German soldier adjusting his posture to observe it. And then there was stillness where motion had been. The first day yielded 11 confirmed kills. The second, 14. By the third day, the pattern had become clear enough to German NCOs that orders were issued warning troops to be alert to American decoy objects placed in forward positions. But the warning had a fatal flaw. It described what to avoid looking at without solving the deeper problem of how to find the man who had placed it there. The German soldiers who received that briefing in frozen foxholes understood they were being hunted. They did not understand from where. And the uncertainty itself became a weapon. Men who are uncertain do not hold their positions with the same steadiness. They scan too widely. They shift. They present angles they would not present if they were calm and anchored. The sniper's technique did not merely kill 987 men. It destabilized a sector of the line so thoroughly that after action reports from the German 12th Infantry Division noted significant disruption to forward observation and patrol activity in the affected zone during the 6-day period. On the fourth day, a German officer, a Hauptmann, a captain, a man documented in captured records as one Muller, was identified at a command relay point approximately 140 meters from the established secondary position. Muller was a trained observer. He had, according to later recovered field notes, identified the decoy as a decoy. He had reasoned correctly that the cup was positioned to draw fire and that the actual shooter must be positioned at an oblique angle to the cup's location, exploiting the natural human tendency to orient toward the object of observation rather than scan perpendicular to it. He had worked it out systematically in the methodical way that the German military education system had taught him to work through problems. He raised his binoculars. He began scanning perpendicular to the cup. He was scanning in the wrong perpendicular direction. He fired. The cup flipped. Coffee sprayed across the frozen route. And Muller was gone in the same heartbeat, struck from 60 degrees left of the position he had been scanning, from a range of 112 meters, by a man who had moved his primary firing position twice since dawn, who had anticipated that trained eyes would eventually deduce the general principle of the trick, while still being wrong about the specific geometry of its execution. On the 5th and 6th days, the technique was adapted once more. The secondary position was doubled. 2 cups, 2 apparent locations, a wider arc of uncertainty for any German observer attempting to triangulate the shooter's actual position. The final tally, as recorded in the Divisional Intelligence Summary dated November 25, 1944, stood at 97 confirmed casualties for the 6-day period, attributed to a single sniper operating in the contested sector between Hill 203 and the Raffles-Brand Trail Junction. In the weeks that followed, other American snipers across the division began incorporating variants of the technique. Sergeant Robert Mitchell of the 4th Infantry Division adapted what the men had taken to calling the coffee cup trick for urban combat, as American forces pushed into German cities in early 1945, placing heated objects in windows of cleared buildings to simulate occupied positions, drawing German Defensive fire into already clear zones while his actual position was established 2 buildings back. The principle traveled further than its originator could have anticipated. It appeared in informal training notes. It was discussed in after-action reviews. By February of 1945, at least 23 confirmed kills across the division were attributed to direct adaptations of the technique and the underlying logic that an enemy's own training could be turned into the mechanism of his undoing had become a kind of informal doctrine among American sniper units in the European theater. What is most remarkable about this episode, seen clearly from the distance of 8 decades, is not the number. 97 is a number. Numbers can be absorbed, contextualized, placed against the vast arithmetic of a war that consumed tens of millions of lives. What is remarkable is the geometry of the trick itself, what it revealed about the space between doctrine and reality, between what an army trains its soldiers to believe and what the world actually contains. German sniper doctrine was excellent. It was rigorous, thorough, and correct in its general principles. Steam rising in a cold landscape does indicate warmth. Warmth does indicate human presence. Human presence does indicate a potential target. Every step in that chain of logic was sound. The doctrine was not wrong. It was simply operating on an assumption that the American army would behave the way the doctrine predicted, that American soldiers would be cautious with their warmth, that they would not have enough to spare for decoys, that a tin cup of hot coffee would always mean a soldier was nearby rather than a deliberate lure placed by a man lying in the frozen dark 60 degrees to the left. The assumption behind the doctrine was material. It assumed equivalence of scarcity. It assumed that an American soldier in a contested forest in November 1944 faced the same calculus of resource and conservation that a German soldier faced. It assumed that coffee, warmth, abundance, these were things to be hoarded, protected, rationed as carefully as ammunition. The doctrine was built on the logical premise of a nation at the far end of an overstretched supply line, delivering the last of what it had to men who could not afford waste. It was built, in other words, on Germany's own reality projected onto an enemy who did not share that reality. The United States Army, by the autumn of 1944, was the most abundantly supplied fighting force in the history of organized warfare. Its soldiers received, per day, more than 3 times the caloric intake of their German counterparts. Its supply chains, extending back across the Atlantic to factories running 3 shifts around the clock, delivered not merely the essentials of survival, but the small surpluses of comfort, chocolate, cigarettes, chewing gum, and coffee that told a man his nation had not forgotten him, had not calculated him to within an ounce, and decided there was nothing left to give. A tin cup of coffee was a signal. It said, "There is more where this came from." It said, "We are not running out." It said in the quiet language that material conditions speak more loudly than any propaganda that the country sending these men into this forest could afford to fill their cups and then fill them again, indefinitely, and still have enough left over to leave a cup steaming on a frozen route as bait for an enemy trained to believe that warmth, in a war like this, was never wasted. The German soldiers who died over those 6 days did not die because their doctrine was foolish. They died because their doctrine was built for a world in which the enemy they faced was like them, constrained, calculating, making every gram count. They died because they encountered instead a nation whose industrial democracy had, by 1944, achieved a material output so vast and so sustained that it had changed the very nature of what was possible on a battlefield. They died because the cup was always full. The sniper who placed that cup went on to survive the war. He returned to a country that would never fully understand what he had done in those 6 days, or perhaps would understand it only as a number in a report, 97, confirmed. Hurtgen, November 1944. He did not speak at length about it, as was true of so many of the men who had seen the worst of that forest. But in a brief statement recorded in a divisional history compiled in the 1950s, he described the technique with a plainness that carried more weight than any dramatization could. He said, in the flat, factual language of a man from a cold state, who had learned patience before he had learned to shoot, that he had simply given them something to look at. Something warm. Something that smelled like morning. Something that looked, for just a moment, like there was a man nearby who had time to spare, who had enough, and then some, and was not afraid to show it. He had given them a cup of coffee, and they had looked at it the way men look at warmth when they have been cold for too long. And in that moment of looking, of leaning slightly forward, of adjusting the angle of their bodies toward the small human comfort that steam represents, in that moment, he had found them. The tin cup is empty now. The Hurtgen forest has grown back over the craters and the foxholes, over the rusting fragments of artillery and the tree stumps that still bear the scars of shrapnel in their heartwood. The trail junction where those 6 days unfolded is quiet in November. A hiker might walk through it on a cold morning, breath rising in small white clouds, and notice nothing unusual. Only the ancient density of spruce and fir. Only the silence that a living forest holds, like a held breath. The ground beneath does not announce what it has absorbed. The trees do not mark what they witnessed. But somewhere in the cold air of that forest, something lingers that no archive fully captures and no number fully expresses. It is the idea that freedom carries weight. Not just the philosophical weight of its principles or the political weight of its institutions, but a physical, material, measurable weight. The weight of supply chains that do not break. The weight of factories that do not stop. The weight of a nation so committed to the men it sends into the dark that it ensures they wake in a frozen forest with hot coffee in their cups. That abundance is not decadence. It is not softness. It is, in the cold mathematics of total war, a weapon. It is the expression in pounds and calories and tin cups and steam of what a free society can produce when it decides that the men fighting for it deserve everything it can give. The steam rose. The doctrine followed. The freedom held. And on the frozen floor of the Hurtgen, 60 degrees to the left of where they were looking, a young man from a cold state breathed out once, slowly, and did not waste a single breath.